Hi everyone, thanks for coming along to today's webinar. Brad's running a bit late, so I'm just going to get started by myself for this. But thank you all for coming along to the final session of the Stormwater Fundamental series this year, which will be about WSUD maintenance compliance. While we wait for some more people to join today, I'll just go through some basic stuff. So far this year, we've completed 11 sessions for this series, with today being the 12th one, being about WSUD maintenance compliance. And if you're interested in actually seeing any of the recordings or slides of any of the sessions from this year, you're able to do that on our webinars page on our website. And if you don't want to miss out on upcoming events and webinars and information, you can always subscribe to our newsletter. I would also like to confirm for the people that haven't heard this yet, but we will be doing this again next year with a whole range of other topics with a bunch of partnered organizations on this: eWater, Quilty Engineering Hub, and Optimal Stormwater. And so if you want to register for any of those, you can do that on our events page on our website. And again, you could subscribe to our newsletter if you don't want to miss out on any information for upcoming events. I would also just like to highlight that next week, Ocean Protect and Derwent Estuary Program are hosting a stormwater symposium down in Tasmania. If you haven't registered for it yet and you're in Tasmania, make sure to do that. We'd love to see you there. Registrations will be closing this week though, so make sure to get that in soon. I would also just like to highlight some amazing news for Ocean Protect is that we have finally received SquidUp verification for the Filterra product that we sell. Now, I'm not a salesperson or an engineer, so I can't really talk too much about it, but Brad will be on a bit later, and if there's any questions, he can talk about it at the end of today's webinar. Before we get started, just a conflict of interest declaration here. I work for Ocean Protect, which is a company that supplies, installs, and maintains WSUD assets. So there is a conflict of interest around the topic of improving WSUD maintenance compliance. However, just for transparency's sake, I wanted to put that out at the very front. Now, for those of you not familiar with Ocean Protect, we've installed over 70,000 assets in Australia, estimating a capture of about 11,000 kilograms of pollution every day, capturing around 24 million kilograms of pollution to date since our start over 20 years ago. And that's assuming that these assets are getting maintained. However, the reality is a lot of assets aren't getting maintained in Australia, and that's the whole purpose of today's webinar, to talk about WSUD maintenance compliance, about how we can make sure that these assets are being maintained and can achieve these sorts of numbers. Now, some reminders before we start into everything. If you have any questions, if you can put them in the Q&A panel, that just makes it easier for us to answer them at the end. If you're interested in getting access to the slides and recordings, they will be made available on our webinars page on our website. I have provided the link in the chat for that. And if you're looking to get a CPD form, if you can send your request for that via email to inquiries@oceanprotect.com.au. Now, last webinar I did last month was about WSUD asset maintenance, talking about some basic stuff about maintenance, what are WSUD assets, why they need maintenance, who can maintain them, how to maintain them, and much more similar sort of stuff. If you're interested in that sort of information, I would encourage you to watch the recording of last month's webinar. However, what I'm going to be covering today are the foundations, or what I consider the foundations of a WSUD maintenance compliance program: having a legal framework, having funding, having an information management system, processes, education, and recognition. So for those of you not familiar with my work, I just wanted to highlight this because I will be talking about this a bit throughout today. The WSUD Maintenance Compliance Framework is a project I've been leading for nearly 2 years now, and it's a project it's a free package of information, resources, and tools to help councils improve the implementation and management of WSUD assets within their jurisdiction. It's primarily kind of targeted for private asset compliance. However, there are elements of this that can be helpful for public assets as well. And I will be talking about elements of this throughout today, but that's what I mean for this. In terms of the legal framework for a compliance program, I think there's a few key things that we need to be thinking about if you're trying to look to implement a compliance program to ensure that you have the ability to enforce compliance. Firstly, having good planning controls in place. For example, Blacktown City Council has their BDCP Part J, which is looking at WSUD and integrated water cycle management. And within that, they do state things about requiring maintenance contracts, maintenance schedules, covenants, and that sort of stuff. And so basically development needs to be done in accordance with that. And so I think having strong foundational planning controls is an important part of having that legal framework in place for a program. I would then say the WSUD system agreements is an important part as well. So this is a term I've kind of coined because I was looking at the types across the country, but everyone has their own different terminology for this. It could be a positive covenant, it could be a restrictive covenant, it could be an easement, it could be a Section 173 agreement in Victoria, Part 5 agreement in Tasmania, our land management agreement in South Australia. So the terminology changes, but basically what I'm recommending here is to put in place a agreement between a landowner and the council or the regulatory authority that provides the authority certain legal rights. And so within the Blacktown one, they've got the rights to enforce kind of reporting and maintenance and the ability to inspect the WSUD system when they need to, and being able to cover costs when they've done work on the property. And so I think having this is a really important part if you're looking to set up a compliance program. The next thing I would be looking at is making sure that you have strong development conditions in place. Now, within the WSUD maintenance compliance framework, I do propose 4 conditions for this. And the purpose of this is requiring certain things to happen during the development stage is important so that it's set up for that operational stage for the property so that councils have that ability to enforce compliance. And so what I'm proposing in this space is to have one condition that looks at having a maintenance schedule or some sort of document like that in place, which clearly outlines council's requirements for the management of that WSUD system on the property. Condition 2 would be looking at providing some sort of evidence to council that there's been some sort of maintenance contract, agreement, arrangement put in place, at least initially for a certain period, to ensure that the assets are going to be maintained at the start. With this, Blacktown City Council has kind of a minimum prepaid 5-year period for that sort of condition. Gold Coast and Brisbane also kind of have stuff for that as well. But I think that's an important condition to have in place to make sure that things start from the very start. Next condition would be looking at having that WSUD system agreement in place. So having it registered against the title of the property so that it will always be against the title of the property and not between the council and the property owner at that time. You want to make sure it's against the title. And then condition 4 is going to vary depending on the council's kind of context and situation, but having one clearly state that the WSUD system must be maintained for the life of the development in accordance with council's requirements. This really gives councils that legal grounding to enforce compliance, because if a development condition isn't follow through with during the operational stage, that does provide an opportunity for a fine that could be issued to someone not doing that maintenance. And finally, looking at legislation. So as part of the framework, WSUD maintenance compliance framework, we had some lawyers look at legislation across the country. Firstly, looking at New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria. They highlighted some legislation like the one on the screen right now, which really highlights that if assets aren't being maintained, they could be breaching certain legislation, it could be causing environmental harm, it could be breaching a general environmental duty, it could be causing some sort of pollutants or other offense. And so there are some significant and hefty fines for that within those states. For example, in New South Wales, potentially a maximum penalty of $10 million for a corporation. So that's also another avenue of enforcing compliance. The next foundation I would highlight is funding. You're not going to be able to do this program if you don't have that funding to do it. Firstly, identifying a source of funding and establishing it and having that is critical. For New South Wales, you can look towards the Stormwater Management Service Charge. There's been a whole bunch of other webinars and stuff recently about funding, so I'm not going to touch on it too much, but there are other opportunities across the country to kind of maybe get some funding to look at implementing a compliance program to ensure these assets are getting maintained and managed appropriately. And you also don't have to think about just having funding just for this single program. You could have it that this program attaches onto another compliance program, another environmental program within the organization, so that you're not actually having to kind of stress about starting a whole new thing. You're kind of working with what's already established. I'd also say understanding the costs around maintenance, whether this is public or private, just being able to be realistic about how much it costs to manage these assets. And so something I'd encourage people to look towards is the work that Water Sensitive Cities Australia is doing at the moment, which is developing a life cycle costing tool. And so by understanding the costs, it's helpful to manage this from start to end of that life cycle of these assets. And my real important thing to put here on this slide is don't forget maintenance. People get so caught up on how much it costs to install and construct and implement these assets, but so many people just forget about how much it's going to cost to maintain it long term. So it might be cheaper to implement it at the start. However, if you're not thinking long term, it might actually end up costing you a lot more. The next thing I'm going to be talking about is within such a program, you're going to be seeing a lot of data and information that you'll need to manage. Property details, contact details, asset information, development history, and a whole range of other things that you need to be aware of. And so for this, what I'm recommending is making sure you have some sort of information management system in place that will ensure simple data management, allow for some sort of automation, allow for online reporting, and easy to use within the WSUD maintenance compliance framework. There is a mock-up IMS that I've provided so that people can play around and see what they need. But basically, to really simplify this program, you need this system in place so that you can reduce the amount of capacity, reduce the amount of time, resourcing that needs to be put towards it. So automating it, online reporting can help save councils a lot of time with this program. And it's also really important to have a system that's tracking all the data and information, because if you're trying to enforce compliance against a property and you get to the enforcement stage and take them to court or issue a fine, however, you don't have that kind of history of that development documented and noted down, it could be very easy to kind of, I guess, lose that case if you don't have that background context. Another important thing is having processes in place. Again, the framework provides a whole bunch of process maps to outline different processes. This is the high-level process map. But basically, you want to make sure that you have processes in place, created, developed, and actually followed. Again, being a compliance program, you want to make sure you have a standardized approach that gives multiple opportunities to do the right thing, but flexibility to go, I guess, hard with the stick to enforce the compliance if needed. Because again, if you're taking people to court, issuing fines, and asset owners decide to push back, if you have processes that you followed, you can outline exactly what you've done and how you've done it. So within a compliance program for WSUD maintenance, I propose that there's a development process, which is really just where you're implementing and ensuring that development conditions are put in place and are being met. I would then say you need an identification process, one that looks at identifying existing systems so that you can identify things from the past, because there's already a lot of assets installed across Australia, so you won't be able to capture a lot through the process of development. The operational process, which is looking at welcoming them into the property, ensuring that the assets are being maintained, and then deciding whether you're going to do an audit or not on that property. Then finally, if you get to the auditing process, which is where you're actually checking if things are done compliantly, look at sending the information, but then doing a desktop audit at the start, kind of checking things, saving that resourcing, saving that capacity. And if things are non-compliant, then moving on to an actual property audit where you go to the property and do a site visit and actually check things there. That way it can kind of help reduce the amount of time and effort to do an audit. And then finally, enforcement. Again, there's going to be different ways you might do enforcement, issuing fines, issuing orders, notices, taking them to court. Really depends on the situation. But within the whole framework, there are whole documented process maps and instructions on how the proposed processes could work. But basically, what I really want to highlight here is, again, have these processes documented, developed, and followed. Otherwise, it could cause issues in terms of enforcing compliance. The next thing is education. And so with education, what I would highlight here is that you really need to be looking at educating and engaging stakeholders throughout the program. Firstly, you want to be looking at council staff, so looking at the people internally that either need to support your program or need to understand or be involved in that program. You want to make sure everyone understands what they need to do, but also making sure that higher up people, directors, managers, general managers, councillors, all are kind of familiar with what you're doing, because if a developer or an asset owner complains to someone senior, you want to make sure that they don't come to you with issues that they are already supporting you. And so you could do that through educational material, but you could also do events and meetings and workshops to help make sure that everyone understands. You want to be looking at educating and engaging with the asset owners and managers. You want to make sure that they understand what you're actually enforcing. You need to make sure that they understand the assets, where they are, they need to be doing, because that will make it much easier to enforce compliance, because they'll be much more informed and understand what you're doing. Next would be developers. So these are the people meeting those development conditions being put in place to require certain things be done during development. And so educating them, engaging with them, helping them understand why they need to be doing certain things and what they need to be doing is an important step. Engaging and educating these people doing the work is important. So helping maintenance contractors, suitably qualified persons, understand what they need to do, when they need to do it, and how they need to do it. And so that's an important part, because if they don't know what they're doing, the assets aren't going to get managed appropriately. And then also the community is an important group to be educating, engaging. They might not own assets and be responsible for managing this, but by educating them and raising their awareness, more attention and more focus from your council can be put towards this. Because if there's interest and support for more funding, for more resourcing, for more capacity, more work to be done in this space, you have more chance to get that funding, which again was another key foundation for the program. Another thing to look towards is recognition. So incentivizing and recognizing people for doing the right thing. So not just coming with that kind of, I guess, stick, but coming with that carrot to kind of help them, motivate them, encourage them to do the right thing. For example, Blacktown City Council, I guess, kind of on the smaller scale, has an environmental recognition business program, which they can use to recognize, encourage businesses in the LGA to do the right thing. However, you might also look towards doing something on a much larger scale and looking for some sort of certification that already exists that you could work with, or maybe establish a whole new one. But for example, Green Star, maybe Green Star certification, that is something that maybe as an industry we could look towards kind of working with and being part of, so that if properties want their Green Star certification, they need to be maintaining their assets. So look, that is kind of getting close to the end of everything for this webinar, but just some take-home messages for everyone before we wrap up and get into Q&A. Firstly, assets are not being maintained. That's the reality. You'll hear certain different numbers from different studies or different people, typically ranging from about 5 to 20% is what I'm hearing, more towards that 5%. And look, that is an issue causing a whole range of issues for the environment, the economy, the communities. So that needs to be fixed. In my opinion, councils establishing WSUD maintenance compliance programs will be helpful for that. They have the ability to enforce compliance and make sure that they are getting maintained, because without enforcement, without pressure to do the maintenance, it's not going to happen. And so the foundation for such a program is having that legal framework in place so that you have the legal grounds to enforce compliance, having that funding in place so that you can be funded and do the work, but also not stressing about the future of the program and its ability to do what it needs to do. But also understanding how much money you have can help you influence how big and how, I guess, what scale your program can be. Having a information management system is important, because there's a lot of data and information within such a program, and you want to make sure it's all tracked and kept and recorded, so that if you do start doing enforcement, you have it documented, but also just for your own sake and understanding of a property, you have that in one location. You want to be developing and documenting and following processes so that everything is standardized, everything is consistent, so that once you get to enforcement, there's no issues around or questions about what you've done. And in education, you want to be educating everyone to make sure that they understand what they need to do, why they need to do it, and how they need to do it. And then recognition, again, just incentivizing and recognizing to encourage people to do the right thing. And hopefully with all of these kind of foundations in place, you have the ability to use the carrot and the stick, but also have all the things to kind of educate them, engage them, and keep track of everything. And so that is where the WSUD maintenance compliance framework comes into place. Haven't really talked too much about it today, but if people are interested in learning more, happy to have a meeting and chat about it, or an email or a phone call. But it contains a whole bunch of resources, information, absolutely free. You can take it, use it, scan that QR code, and get access, and it will help you. And so look, that is the end of the presentation. Just before we get into Q&A, just some reminders. If you can put your questions in the Q&A panel, the slides and recordings will be made available on our website. And if you're looking to get a CPD form, send it to inquiries@oceanprotect.com.au. This was the final session of this year's Stormwater Fundamental Series. However, we will be doing it again next year. If you're wanting to find the recordings, go to our webinars page on our website and subscribe to our newsletter if you don't want to miss out on upcoming events. And if you found today's webinar interesting, consider joining the National WSUD Compliance Network, where we'll be talking about the framework and other WSUD compliance issues. The next meeting will be in February. If anyone's interested, that giant QR code will take you to it. Otherwise, go to wsudcompliance.com.au for more. And that is the end of the presentation. And I guess just before we go into Q&A, I might just ask Brad if he has anything he wants to comment on about the Stormwater Fundamental Series, or I also mentioned the squared up approval at the start.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for presenting. Yeah, look, I think the main thing is I'd like to say thank you for everyone who's given up their time to participate in the Fundamental Series for this year. It's been incredible. It's been very humbling and super exciting to see how many people are dialing in and attending and watching the webinars. We are getting better at it in terms of, we had a bit of a backlog in CPD forms. We really weren't anticipating as many people attending as we ended up getting. So there has been historically a bit of a backlog on the CPD forms, but we're going to streamline that all next year. It'll be so much simpler. And yeah, excited to see another round of fundamental series, all provided for free to the stormwater industry in Australia and beyond. So yeah, thanks to everyone for attention so far, but looking forward to dialing in for more good times next year, in addition to a whole bunch of other events. Obviously, Daniel, I'm in Tasmania next week to help out with the Stormwater Symposium down there, but there's other symposiums planned and other webinars, non-fundamentals, going into more technical detail on a bunch of other things. So exciting times. I didn't have anything more to add, but just a reminder, folks, obviously everyone's been really, look, we've got a lot of people dialed in. I can see 168 people still attending, but we've got no questions in the Q&A, which is bizarre. Obviously, Daniel's covered this topic brilliantly, answered all the potential questions that everyone might have had. I might actually kick things off with a question for Daniel if there's no questions coming through. I guess the key thing is where's the WSUD compliance framework at? So it's been a lot of work involved to date. What's the next steps?
Yeah, so I guess for everyone's benefit, I've been working on this since the start of last year. And basically in April this year, we released it as a consultation draft, and that went for 4 months. And over 500 people got involved. There's been a whole bunch of feedback and comments and stuff from that. And so at the moment, I'm looking to review that and actually act on that feedback and consultation. And then my kind of plan is that in February or April for the next National WSUD Compliance Network meeting to kind of try re-release a second version of the framework built upon the feedback that the industry has provided, the valuable feedback that the industry has provided, because there's been a lot of comments and interesting things that I hadn't even considered. So that's kind of that. And then next year looking at, having a guideline outlining how to do a whole bunch of other things as well. So there's a lot more to come out next year for this.
Cool. The questions are starting to roll through now. So Darren Carlson, greetings, Darren from Brisbane City Council. Darren says, hey guys, great presentation. As you note, compliance will start with the planning scheme. Why do you suppose a WSUD maintenance compliance is not required by the state as per private wastewater treatment?
I feel like there's been people, the general public understand maybe wastewater a bit more because it's a bit more thing to easy to understand. So from that public awareness, I think there hasn't been enough pressure and pushing for kind of more state involvement in the space of stormwater. I do think that is changing. This year, I've had conversations with a few different departments from state government, and it does seem that they're starting to write guidelines, procedural guides, and a whole bunch of other things in this space. So I do feel like state government is taking a bit of a step in this space. However, there is still a lot more that state government can be doing, but I really think it's just that pressure from an awareness of stormwater that's been an issue for
Mm.
everything in the industry, really, not just maintenance of these.
Yeah, if I can add to that as well, like it's worth noting that I think correct me if I'm wrong, the Victorian state planning provisions do refer to not just designing assets to achieve the targets, but managing the assets
Yep.
to meet the targets. So Victoria, they do refer to that requirement. And in Queensland, which is where I'm based, the Department of Environment and Science is certainly aware of this as an issue. And from what I understand, it's anticipated that the state planning policy will eventually be updated to include a requirement around demonstrating ongoing management of these assets. So yeah, whilst it might not be, widespread across Australia now, I think that will change because, to Daniel's point before, like what 5 to 25% of assets are only getting maintained. That means what 95 to 75% aren't being maintained. That's crazy, and it's clearly an area of that we could make great strides in improving. I'll move on to the couple other questions. So, a question from Warren Oos. Apologies if I mispronounced that. Warren says there was a lot of information on the slides. Can you provide the slides for us to read in more detail?
Yep. So after today, I'll be looking to get these up on our website at the webinars page on our website. Basically, it'll have the recording of today, and it will also have the slides there. So everyone can head there in a few days, and you'll see it there.
Mm.
But if you also have questions, feel free to reach out as well. I'm happy to meet and discuss things in further.
Sure. A question from Gregory Chian. I think you might have covered this. Gregory asks, how many assets percentage, or what proportion of assets, what percentage of assets do you see are maintained now, and how much improvement on percentage asset management you expect the framework will achieve in, say, 5 years' time?
Yeah. So yeah, I kind of touched, I guess, on that first bit, which is depending on who you ask, you'll kind of get a number between 5 and 20% actually being maintained. In terms of how much improvement on asset management, the framework, the reality is this is a big issue for the industry, and it's probably going to take a lot longer than 5 years to see a big improvement. With the framework, what it's really doing is providing that foundation for councils to start and a kind of more of a standardized foundational way rather than every council doing their own thing. So the framework will speed the process up.
Mm.
It's not going to have all the assets in the country maintained within 5 years, 10 years, but it will help work towards that. And even a 5-10% increase in compliance is better for the environment, better for the economy, better for the community. So yes, it might not get 100% in a short time, but it's the start of something to really work towards that compliance. So there should be an improvement. However, in a short term, kind of medium period, it's going to be a very slow thing where councils have to set things up, start new processes, get approvals, start bringing in assets and starting to enforce things. So for example, at Blacktown City Council, we spent a few years actually redeveloping the program and implementing a trial of it. So I don't think it's going to be a quick thing for every council, but there are councils interested in this, and I am in talks with some at the moment about using the framework.
Mm. If I could add to that as well,
Yeah.
like no report has any impact unless it's actually used. So whilst there's a lot of work that's gone into it already, it's really up to the individual councils and maybe state government to sort of drive this further. Like the work that's gone into it, there's a bunch of, questions. For example, is it illegal to not maintain storm treatment assets? This has been a question I've seen in our industry for 20 years. We paid for independent legal advice on this issue at great expense. Without going into the numbers, it's eye-watering costs, and we got a definitive yes, it is illegal. So that's super valuable for the industry to know that. Then you've got all these tools, resources that can be rolled off the shelf. Literally, another big challenge for councils is just developing appropriate DA conditions and fact sheets and whatever. Daniel and others have contributed to this body of work to essentially make that as easy as possible. And the kicker is, if you need further assistance, you can just reach out to Daniel, and he's
Yep.
giving his time away for free. So
Yep.
there are councils that are already sort of doing the, utilising Daniel's expertise and experience in this area and insights, and we're looking to do trials. But it's up to the individual councils and regulators to essentially take this resource and use it appropriately. And if that doesn't happen, it'll have no impact. But if it does happen, it'll have a significant impact. And I can see this growing with significant momentum very quickly. Anyway, rant over. Another question from Gregory Chan asks, have you considered integration of asset records from development assessment process to construction and commissioning?
Yep. So I do think that's a important thing to be happening, and I know there are people in the industry looking to work on that. However, at the moment with the framework, it's not something that I could develop myself. I'm not a technology person. I can't go developing it. But basically what the framework is supposed to be doing is providing a foundation, and then councils can go to market, find systems that could do something like that to do that. Because I think the more automation from the start of the life cycle to the end of it is really important, because it reduces the burden, the capacity, the resourcing needed. It does just require some upfront capital from councils to implement such a thing like that. And rather than trying to push for that straight away, because the reality is most councils are probably going to say no to that. If I'm like, to do the framework, you have to use this system. The idea is that they can play around with the mock-up information management system. They can build upon it. They can detract from it. They can do what they need to with that, and then try and upgrade and update their internal systems that already exist, that they've spent a lot of time, a lot of money on. But I do think integrating and automating across the industry is important.
Cool. Another question from Kaylin Murray, or Callan Murray, I think. They ask, I think they're asking the question in response to my statement before. Does that mean the state planning policy in the water quality section is the trigger for implementation? Maybe. We'll say I'm second guessing at what the state planning policy might even say to start with, but I think it's just an important space to keep an eye on in the very near future. Sorry if I can't provide more detail, Colin, but happy to reach out further if you'd like to just talk further, or you can just reach out to DES further as well. Question in the chat actually from Adrian Schmidt. Probably something else I said. Question, but
I can talk to it.
Yeah. Adrian asks, when you say that the lawyer said maintenance of private squids are a legal requirement, is it required by the owner or by the authority?
So if we're talking about private assets, basically the private asset owner has a legal requirement to do that maintenance for those numerous reasons, whether it's legislation, development condition, a WSUD system agreement, something else like that. So there are numerous reasons why it could be illegal for the asset owner. In terms of the authority, such as a council, they do also have a legal requirement to enforce that, to do maintenance of their own assets. However, it's a bit more of a grey and case-by-case situation of whether councils could be actually get in trouble for not enforcing maintenance. As a regulatory authority, they would have some sort of responsibility, but whether that's really going to get tested in court is a bit of a different thing and something I can't really talk to. But it is something that councils should be aware of, whether they have kind of a statutory requirement to do it, and if they fail to do that duty, what are the consequences of that? Are they liable for anything? But I'm not a lawyer and can't really talk to case by case on that, but that's just something to be aware of.
Cool. Look, that's it for quick Q&A. We're flushed out of questions, but thanks for everyone who's dialed in for today. Greatly appreciated, and thanks very much for Daniel to giving up his time to share his pearls of wisdom with us today. I look forward to seeing you guys at an event soon. But just a reminder, if you want a CPD form, feel free to email inquiries@oceanprotect.com.au. But also the webinar recording and slides will be made available on our website, oceanprotect.com.au, under the webinars tab, probably in a few days' time.
Yeah. Thanks, Brad, and
Thanks,
thanks
guys.
everyone. Talk soon.
Bye now.
See ya.